I would like to present my analysis of the short story Wild Mushrooms. I will start by telling about the setting, then I will give a characterization of the characters, then I will talk about the narrator, and then I will give my analysis of the symbolic and theme and what I would put the text in perspective to. The text Wild Mushrooms is a short story and therefore fiction. It is though important to mention that there isn't any author of the text, and I therefore assume that it is an extract of a collection of other short stories. The short story is a flashback of the life in Japan, which takes place in a typically February month with snowflakes falling around. The protagonist and his father begin their travel into the past by visiting a lot of different cities in Japan. They start by visiting Atami and then Mishima. They visited Atami because it's well known for its famous resort, which contains a lot of hot springs. Then they stopped at Hamanatsu, which is the best, as the protagonist says, where he is referring to the ability to serve good rice in shaped wooden boxes. The city Hiroshima is also mentioned in the text because it's the hometown of the protagonist, but he doesn't visit the town. Mostly he visits the suburbs nearby the town or the main shopping street in Honduras. There are two characters in this text. There is the child and the protagonist. The child is also the narrator, and we therefore get an inner characterization of him through his actions and thoughts. The child is very multicultural because his father is Japanese, but he was born in America and lived in America. Japan is therefore a very important element in the way of identifying himself. He also says that he finds the predictability of life in Japan very comforting, and he's also very fascinated about the smell. He describes the smell of Japan as the smell of fresh green tea, which his father's suitcases bring along. Among the gifts and the smell from Japan, he assumes that Japan must be a very terrific place, and as a result of that, he moves to Japan later on in the short story. Even though he hasn't got much family in Japan because of the bombing of Hiroshima, where his grandmother and mother died, but he seems though to be very clarified with it. The protagonist in the short story is also the father of the child. He was born in the US because his parents lived in the US in California for 20 years before they moved back to Japan. But as soon as the protagonist turned 18, he moved back to the US again. In the US, he was stationed as a soldier in Camp Shelby. His business trips has brought him back to Japan several times, but he has never visited his hometown, Hiroshima. But in his trip to the past, as he calls it, he finally visits his old neighborhood, where he discovers that everything has changed, which is also exemplified in the search of mushrooms and the old shops, which even haven't been there for years. The narrator in the text is a first-person narrator and also the child, as I mentioned before. We therefore get the story from the child's point of view, and it has the effect that it gives us an inner characterization through his actions, because we observe him through his thoughts and how he handles and describes different situations. I also think that he's very reliable and trustworthy because we all know that the bombing of Hiroshima actually took place, but none of us really know how it affected the individuals in Hiroshima and Japan. I therefore think it's a very great way to get an insight of how it affected the individuals in Hiroshima. Wild mushrooms, which is also the title of the text, furthermore has a symbolic meaning. Wild mushroom is a very essential part of the protagonist's childhood memory, and it's also one of the elements that connects him to Japan. In his trip to Japan, he discovers that everything has changed and he no longer has any relations to Japan. He therefore comes to closure, which is also one of the themes in the text. The closure that he no longer has any relation to Japan. He has lived a very multicultural life by living in both America and then Japan, and I suppose he therefore has been divided on whether Japan and USA was his home. But because he has lived in America because of the fact that he has lived in America for so many years, but still all his family relations are in Japan. I therefore think he's very I therefore think he's torn about where his actual home is, which is another important theme in the story. Because the definition of home is very different from individual to individual, and in this short story, home isn't where the family is, but it is where he as an individual feels like he belongs. Um, because many people would characterize or define the word home as the place where their family is. But in this situation, it is just an environment where he feels that he belongs and where he feels safe and happy, which is in USA. Um, After his visit to Japan, he comes to the closure that the USA definitely is his home, which is also exemplified in the last sentence, which is "So when are you coming home?" Which is the question he asks his child, where he refers to his home in USA since he now has closure. Um, I think that this particularly short story could be put into perspective to another short story that we have read called On the Other Side of the War, a story. Um, on the Other Side of a War is about racial identity among allegiance to family and how individuals with a two-sided ancestry can identify themselves, which is also very similar to this certain story. Therefore, I think this could be put in perspective to the short story On the Other Side of the Wall, since the themes are very similar to each other. Thank you for listening.